Welcome. It's July 10th, 2022. I'm with Ajahn Punnadhammo in Northern Ontario, the abbot of Arrow River Forest Hermitage, and Pannobhasa in Southern Carolina, who was a monk for 30 years. We're going to talk about our subject today is what to do about the fact that Theravada Buddhism was designed for ancient India in the 5th century BC and not the modern West. So how to adapt. So Pannobhasa, this is your suggestion. So you can go first.
All right. Yeah, this is an issue that really I've been giving a lot of thought to for years because it really is an important issue to me, or at least it's an important issue to Western Theravada Buddhists, I think. And as most people know, Theravada Buddhism is the most conservative school of Buddhism. So it's still based on ancient Indian culture, like the the Ganges Valley of, 5th century BC, approximately. And so, especially with regard to cosmology to some degree, with regard to maybe some of the philosophy, but especially with regard to the rules of monastic discipline that monks are required to follow, it's based on ancient India. And if the Buddha were alive today, it's not very likely that he would have the exact same rules in the West that applied to ancient India. Like, for example, the monks' robes, that the robes that monks wear. It wasn't just a special outfit that only monks wore. It's like the lay people essentially wore robes also. It's just that the monks would dye them kind of a dingy brown color and cut them up and sew them back together. Or I've also read that one of the main reasons why monks would cut their hair or they shave their head was that in ancient India, especially the upper class people like Kshatriyas and Brahmins, they'd have long hair and beards, and some of the clans would have their hair arranged in elaborate braids, sort of like Scottish tartans, where you could know what family they belonged to just by the patterns of braids in their hair, that kind of a thing. And so it was like a symbolic act of just cutting off your social status when you cut your hair. And it may be in an age where people had short hair, a lot of people just shaved their head for style reasons. It might be that the monks would have long hair just to be, sort of symbolically renounce, the styles and customs of the society. And there are just a lot of rules that are just troublesome for the West, like the rule that says, monks only allowed to wear 3 robes. If he has an extra robe in addition to the 3 robes, he's got to get rid of it within 10 days. And the 3 robes are all to be worn at the same time: the lower robe, upper robe, and outer robe. And in the temperate zone, I mean, down to about freezing, that I've lived relatively comfortable with just thick wool robes. But a lot of Western monks, they'll just wear, thin, like cotton robes, like muslin or something, that are designed for the tropics. And then they'll be wearing extra clothes in addition to that, which technically is against the rules, although there's really not much you can do, especially like in Northern Ontario or something like that, or, Scandinavia. Then, I mean, you're not allowed to wear anything but sandals for shoes that leave the heels and the toes exposed. You do that and you're going to be losing your toes to frostbite in the wintertime, or you're just going to have to stay inside all the time. Yeah. Or just not handling money is, money is so pervasive. Everything costs something, in a country like America, that just living, not only not handling money, but not handling Kapya Karakas, attendants who handle money, strictly following the rules. You're not even allowed to consent to somebody keeping money on your behalf. And so it's so complicated trying to follow these rules from, ancient India, when money had just been invented and it wasn't that difficult to avoid it. Or, just wearing a brown toga just because in ancient India that's what they wore. Or some of the rules, I mean, you don't even have to bother with them anymore. Accepting food from a naked ascetic, or using a human skull as an alms bowl, that kind of a thing. You can just kind of ignore those because they just don't arise. The opportunity to break the rule doesn't arise. But still, it is a dilemma in the West that a strictly practicing Buddhist monk, a Theravada Buddhist monk, in the West, I've said this before, he's like a tropical potted plant that has to live in a special protected environment with caretakers, taking care of him because he can't just live out naturally. I assume there are some Ajahn Chah monks, I think, who, they'll just stand outside of grocery stores and go for alms around that way, or else they just have, maybe they just have so much charisma that, they just inspire, a willingness to give in strangers, that can happen too. But as a general rule, we're kind of stuck with a tradition, a very conservative tradition that doesn't want to change anything, because usually when you start changing things, you wind up mutating the thing out of recognition, like some Western Theravada Buddhists are attempting to do, or people who call themselves Theravada Buddhists. So, I mean, how do you adjust Theravada Buddhism so that it can prosper in the West without changing the rules? Because nobody really has the right, other than maybe a great council, to change rules. So it's like, it's, if you don't make any adjustments, then Theravada Buddhism is just going to be doomed to being a fringe movement forever and ever in the West, unless somehow you've got some super charismatic saint who is able to just convert people en masse to Theravada Buddhism, and then we'll just switch over to living more like ancient India. But yeah, this is just a difficult issue that for monks, if you have two options. If you're living in the West, you have to start fudging on the rules, or, I mean, you just are kind of a prisoner almost to the rules and to your caretakers. So that's the question.
Well, I can maybe inform people about how, because I'm an Ajahn Chah monk, and I'm living usually I'm by myself here. I'm the only monk here, and we make an attempt to keep the Vinaya. We do fudge on the clothing thing, because as you point out, I wouldn't be able to survive in Northern Ontario without wearing warmer clothing. But they also do, I mean, they're not real strict on that in Thailand either, although they think they are, but they all wear at least a fourth piece of cloth, an angsa they call it. I don't know, I'm not familiar with the Burmese.
Yeah, it'd be anthagite. It's the angsa's shoulder, so it'd be like a vest kind of a thing.
Like a piece of cloth they wear to cover the upper body, and that was only introduced in Thailand in the 19th century, because before that, Thai people, both sexes of Thai people, would walk around topless a lot of the time. And I forget whether it was Mongkut or Chulalongkorn, but one of the kings decreed that custom had to stop because it was causing a scandal amongst Westerners he was trying to impress. So it also included the monks. They had to start covering their upper body when they're in the monastery. But in terms of handling money, it's actually not something that's impossible. Now, I'm a monk for 30 years, and I've traveled overseas and all around Canada and US without handling money and without having an attendant with me. The closest thing to a fudge on that is that we do allow gift cards that are for a specific purpose. It's not like a debit card, but I could have like a card for a Starbucks, so I could have a coffee at the airport. And there is an allowance in Vinaya for what's called my mind's blanking, I forget the Pali, but we call it a steward, a layperson who takes care of the monk's needs. And we always have, in these monasteries in the West, we always depend on having a steward. So it's a layperson that stays at the monastery, and he does the shopping, and often prepares the food or helps in the preparation with others preparing the food. So the monk is not, because alms round is not practical in a lot of places. I'm certainly, if I had to depend on alms around where I live, I'd starve to death. There's nobody, my closest neighbors are like miles away. But and what my experience has been that most of the Western monasteries, even if they're closer to a town, the alms round tradition is carried on to some degree, but it's not as it is in Asia. It's not the central way that they feed themselves. It's like a ritual they do maybe once a week or on opposite days, and the Buddhist followers know that they're coming, and they'll go by their houses and they'll get things in their bowls. So they carry on the tradition without, fulfilling the same purposes it does in Asia. So we make an effort, as you rightly point out, the Theravada is a very conservative tradition, and we make an effort to keep as close to the original tradition as we can and make as few modifications as possible. I can tell you one thing. When I first was going, I knew I was leaving Thailand and going back to Canada, and I had a talk with one of my senior monks, and I asked him, like, some of the Sakya rules, their etiquette rules would end up being, in some situations in the West, would end up actually being counterproductive, because they're intended to, the rules around teaching Dhamma are intended to inspire respect for teaching, for the holding the Dhamma. But I could foresee situations where, which has happened several times, like I'm invited to speak to a university class.
Yeah,
right?
they're all wearing shoes.
Yeah, and if I were to order everybody to take their shoes off before I start talking, it would just be ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Not going to inspire respect.
Yeah, it would. Yeah.
Disrespect.
So, I was told, just use your common sense, that the rules are intended to inspire respect in the Dhamma, and the Sakya rules is basically etiquette, and that's based on ancient India, and you can't always apply them. So that's not so we're not that rigid about these sorts of minor points, but I think the principles for Ajahn Chah monks, particularly, not handling money is kind of, we bottom line. We don't, and also not taking food that hasn't been offered, like not storing your own food and cooking for yourself. Those two things that we really try and adhere to strictly. But we do fudge on the clothing thing in the West for practical purposes. There's really no way around that.
Yeah, there are some just sort of Asian corruptions that have worked their way into Theravada Buddhism that could easily be left behind by Sanghas in the West, sort of like making confession. That nobody that I'm aware of actually makes confession according to the Vinaya Mahavaga, where you say, I committed offense of such and such, I committed such and such offense. And I mean, the Thais just kind of break it down into categories.
No, we do. Well, the way we do it, and I don't know if I can't speak for all Thai monastics, but the Ajahn Chah tradition, when we make confession, we do the formula, like the categories. But if we're conscious of having broken a specific rule, we're expected to express that as well.
So do you explain that in English or Thai or something?
Yeah, in whatever your common language is.
Yeah, that's what I was doing as a junior monk, just trying really hard. But the Burmese has degenerated into just this ritual blah 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 that you say to make your offenses go away.
Yeah, well, we do that as well. That, like, we do both. We do the way we understand this, in case you've committed a minor offense and forgotten about it or overlooked it, then you cover it with the blah blah blah. But to be practicing well and strictly, you should specifically confess your actual offenses at that time.
Yeah, and technically, strictly, you're not allowed to even confess an offense unless you're sure. So there's even a formula in the Pali of one about doubt. If you've got doubt about having committed an offense, there's a different confession you're supposed
Yeah,
to
yeah,
make.
yeah,
But I am
yeah.
completely unaware of anybody ever having made that confession.
I know one monk who did. And he was a little bit of uh, obsessive compulsive, I would say, about the rules, and he wanted to really cover his ass, and he would do that. He would say, he would go through all the offenses, and he would say, and I also, I confess, doubts about parajika, doubts about sanghadasesa, doubts about pachidia, doubts about dukara. And then
Okay.
he added that to his own little formula that he would add on.
Yeah. So I've had this idea, and maybe you could tell me if you think it's a good idea or not, that you could have sort of a quasi sangha of like not really ordained monks that aren't calling themselves bhikkhus, but nevertheless have like the blessing of the sangha. Like in Roman Catholicism, you got like lay sisters and lay brothers. Like most of the nuns you see at the grocery store aren't technically nuns; they're just sort of lay sisters who
Yeah,
aren't fully ordained as nuns because they just stay cloistered and you never see them. And so, just wearing like gray sweats, you wouldn't have to wear the toga. You just wear just plain army surplus or something, and you'd follow maybe less restrictive rules. And so long as you're not teaching anything really heterodox, or so long as you're not deviating from Theravada and Dhamma, there could still be some kind of some blessing that the monks give, and then they could support fully ordained monks and so forth, but start sort of like a semi quasi sangha in the West, just to make it um blend into the culture a little more. I mean, some people could argue that you're supposed to renounce society, and so if you don't fit in, then good. But still, monks, like in Asia, I mean, they're still on the outskirts of society to some degree. You have to participate in the society, and it does seem that there could be changes made. But like I said before, it would take a great council to change any Winia rules, and I don't think that's going to happen.
no,
So
no,
and then that would also make it easier for Western women to be ordained as, or to become nuns, where they're not just for the sake of the status of the name word bhikkhuni. They're taken, they're becoming ordained as bhikkhunis, and then immediately rejecting some of the rules,
right, right.
because it's so you just come up with rules that are applicable for that, are appropriate for the West. Don't call yourself bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, because you wouldn't be fully ordained bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, but still there could be this semi quasi sangha that
Mm.
would allow people to renounce the world and somehow fit into society a little better, into a modern Western non-Indian society.
Well, there is sort of like that already. The idea of a upasaka or a pakao in Thailand is like a layperson who takes 8 precepts. So they can
Yeah.
still handle money and they're still in the world, but they're following 8 precepts all the time.
Yeah.
Usually there's a number of pakaos associated with large monasteries because and sometimes they're on their way to seeking higher ordination, and sometimes they just do a temporary stint as a pakao.
Oh,
And
so that'd be like white robed anagarikas or something.
yeah. Anagarika is the Pali term. Pakao is what they call them in Thailand.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they're called Koyin
Yeah.
no, they're called Pothudo in Burmese.
Okay. And in England, at the English monasteries in the Ajahn tradition, Ajahn Sumedho, many years ago, before there were any Western bhikkhunis, he established they call them Dasasila nuns, 10 precept nuns. That they couldn't call themselves full bhikkhunis, but they were keeping pretty tight vinaya. They didn't handle money, and they followed in most of the major rules, but they couldn't call themselves bhikkhuni. And I remember back in the day, when before there was all the controversies and about this reestablishing the bhikkhuni order, when there essentially wasn't any, or they were very obscure. I spoke to one of these Dasasila nuns, and I asked her, "Do you wish that you could be a fully ordained bhikkhuni?" And she said, "No, I don't want that, because the rules are too onerous, restrictive for a bhikkhuni."
Yeah, it's even against the rules for a bhikkhuni to sit cross-legged.
Yeah, and they're not supposed to be ever be alone. You know, they always have to have a companion.
Yeah, they're not allowed to sit in the presence of a bhikkhu. They got to remain standing.
There's a lot of rules, and none of the modern bhikkhunis really keep those rules, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Not strictly.
Yeah, so they just immediately, right off the bat, have started breaking the rules.
I also had another interesting conversation once with a Westerner. This was in California at the city of 10,000 Buddhists, where there's a large number of Mahayana bhikshunis there than there are bhikshus, you know, and somehow it was like it was at a conference, and there was like a session talking about Vinaya, and we got talking about the Garudhammas. And I had read a book that interpreted that the and made some good arguments from a scholarly point of view, that the Garudhammas were and that whole story about the establishment of the Bhikkhuni order was very much later. It wasn't really verbatim what happened at the Buddhist time, and the Garudhammas were a later invention. And I mentioned that without advocating it or not, you know, and she got kind of upset, this bhikshuni, and she said the Garudhammas are the foundation stone of our practice.
Oh,
good.
Mahayana was upset. I guess that's not surprising, though.
Well, the city of 10,000 Buddhists, they try and follow strict Vinaya. They're kind of rare amongst Mahayanas. They do a very good job of following Vinaya. In some ways, they're stricter than we are.
You should mention they donated the land to us for our Abhayagiri Monastery in Redwood
Yes.
Forest near
That's
San Francisco. Very kind of them, you know?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
It's kind of odd that they chose the name Abhayagiri, though, since that was like the rival monastery to the what was it? The Mahavihara in Sri Lanka. That was like, they were like the heretics or something, according to the official chronicles.
Yeah, I know. I should ask somebody about the early days there, whether they were aware of that or not. It might have they just the Pali name Fearless Mountain and liked it, you know.
Yeah. So Ajahn, what would you suggest as, you know, how Theravada could better take root in the West?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is. Like, I have seen in the 25 plus years I've been back in the West, I've seen the Theravada become much more established and accepted and known. When I first came back in the late 90s, if I was out in public in my robes, people would call me Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that in years. And often now people will approach me and they say, "Oh, are you a bhikkhu? What tradition are you in?" You know, and people have more knowledge now. And I have also seen amongst lay Buddhists over that course of time a maturing interest in picking up more aspects of the practice and the religion than in the beginning. All they wanted to do was sit vipassana. You know, that was, you know, lay people did. Everything else was cultural baggage, right?
Yeah, including 5 precepts in a lot of cases.
Including 5 precepts, you know. But now I'm seeing a lot of lay people are learning at least a little Pali, and they're taking an interest in Paritta chanting, and they want to hear about you know, more obscure teachings. I'm seeing a maturing in the practice, you know.
Yeah, I get a lot of comments about people wanting like a flesh and blood community, like even some place where they can take their kids, and the kids will be looked after while they're meditating, and like a Christian church
Yeah.
sort of environment. And for me, it's just it's we're so sparsely scattered
Mm.
that, I mean, mainly if you're going to belong to a Theravada Buddhist group in the West, it's going to be online as a general rule, unless you can find a community. I suppose you've got a community going in there in Ontario,
Well,
but they're relatively rare.
we've got it's pretty small, the local people, but I do have a, a dedicated group of people who are, you know, I would say maybe about a dozen that are the inner circle, and then more that are, occasional coming. But yeah, a lot of my support and activities are a broader afield. Like I used to travel at least 3-4 times a year and teach in different venues up until this scamdemic started. Then I haven't traveled since then. But I do a lot of online stuff, and we get people coming here from all over the place. Currently, we've got a young man from South Africa here, and I've had people from overseas before, but we get people from all over North America on a very regular basis. Come and stay for a few weeks or a few months.
Yeah, it's still not quite the same as having a neighborhood church.
No, not at all. No.
Yeah, and there are people that really want that. I've met a few. I've spoken with a few Buddhist people. I mean, they're Buddhists. They believe in Dhamma, but nevertheless, they'll go to Christian churches just for the community aspect of it.
Yeah.
And then their children are being taught some kind of values, some kind of morals.
Yeah. Some of the expat communities, like the Sri Lankans I know in Toronto, there's a large Sri Lankan community. They have a real community thing going, but it's not really so accessible to Westerners.
Yeah, the Asians each have their own temples and their own groups and everything. And
yeah,
usually it's like a cultural center, like the Burmese monasteries. It's mostly some of the monks will try to teach meditation and so forth, but it's mostly cultural centers where people go to speak Burmese and eat Burmese food and do Burmese ceremonies and that sort of thing.
Yeah. That's the same with the Thais and the Sri Lankans.
Yeah. At least the Sri Lankans speak English, or at least the monasteries I've been to in the West, they're mostly speaking English in the temple instead of Sinhalese or Thai or Burmese or something.
I think you're right that we're spread too thin in the West. Like I hear that same sentiment that the Christians seem to be best at having a sense of community, real sense of community, but Theravadins were kind of thin. We don't have that,
Yeah. I've read that the way Buddhism has traditionally spread to new countries is it converts the aristocrats and the rulers and so forth. And then from there, it kind of trickles downwards. But yeah, I don't know what the odds of that happening in the West would be. I mean, Scientology has gotten a lot of celebrities, but
well, there's a lot of Buddhist celebrities, but mostly not Theravada. There's a lot of Tibetan Buddhists and Nichiren Buddhists and amongst Hollywood celebrities.
Yeah.
I think one example of success is the new Kadampa tradition based in England, Tibetan Buddhist group. I've seen them grow here in Vancouver since I started around 1997. They're quite successful. Like they'll start in somebody's living room. Like someone will start their courses within a year and a half or two. They're teaching the courses from the book, and they have like 4 people in their living room, and then they'll grow and they expand out, and then they have a center, and they financially support it. They're quite successful. I think their largest group in the Western Hemisphere. Like I think the Eclipse Shambhala used to be the biggest one, another Tibetan Buddhist group, but they have their own form of monasticism, a lot of lay people, but they really penetrate, and have centers all over the place and have a real community, a real thing happening. And Theravadins, guess we're not growing in that way. Like we have monasteries with the monks, but New Kadampa tradition example, I think pretty successful in growing, spreading out there.
Now, part of the thing with Theravada too is that in the West, Theravada in the West is that before we had any monasteries here, the form was retreat centers. So that, that's like a brand new kind of format, and those tend to be not so much a local community, but it's people from far away to attend the retreats, right?
Yeah, like the 10-day retreat format, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some places they do have, like sometimes Buddhists try and establish, Theravada Buddhists try and establish their small communities, sitting groups or book studies and things, and they have some success, but it's not really catching on so much.
Yeah, I was doing that. Like, I had about 15 people. I founded the Theravada community of Burnaby, just outside of Vancouver. We had about 70 members every Wednesday night. About 15 of us, we would meet in somebody's house. This is around 2003, 2005, that period. That went for a while and then it fizzled out. Yeah, usually you're meeting in somebody's house, something like that.
Yeah.
But it didn't really grow. Yeah, these groups would come and go. They don't seem to really grow.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen that phenomenon. Yeah, there's a group I was associated with on and off in Toronto that went through numerous cycles and changes of names, and whether they wanted to commit themselves to being Theravada or just general Buddhist, or they can never really sort of settle on
There are people that are turning towards Theravada. Like, obviously you've got a lot of people on the political left, political and cultural left, like in just some really weird ideas, like just really emphasizing queer studies and it's global warming, just all the leftist stuff. It's like they're trying to turn Theravada into essentially just Buddhism flavored cultural Marxism or whatever. And then you've got like people on the right that, you've got like pagans, for example. They want some kind of Indo-European religion. They want some sort of traditionally like European religion that isn't worshiping a deified Jewish person, for example. And it's like all of the Indo-European spiritual traditions in the West have died out or are just vestigial. So a lot of people are just looking towards Buddhism as possibly some kind of like genuinely Indo-European tradition. And some of these people, they're very sincere. They want like some kind of regimented system to follow. They want moral standards and so forth. Others are maybe just there's some people that are like militant fascists that just want some kind of they want some legitimate spiritual label to stick onto themselves or something. So you got not so much in the center, but on the edges, both ends of the spectrum, you've got people that are interested, but the people on the left are just essentially turning it into something that isn't Theravada. And the people on the right, some of them are just traditionalists, conservative traditionalists that like Theravada. But others, of course, like the militant fascist types are just trying to turn it into some sort of almost like the Knights Templar kind of a thing, like warrior monks or something. So, that's not going to be genuine Theravada either.
Right. Yeah. And that kind of brings up, the broader question of adapting Buddhism to modern times versus the ancient Indian cultural milieu. And we kind of covered how that applies to the monks' rules and so on. But I think it's actually a more fundamental question is how it applies to the teachings, and I think the bottom line to me is that the Buddhist teachings are akaliko, they're timeless. They apply in ancient India and they apply today. It may be some of the language used and the the allegories and the metaphors are taken from the culture and of the time. And but the basic principles like paticca samuppada, not self, the eightfold path, you know, these basic teachings are timeless. They apply in any cultural context.
Yeah.
And it also has occurred to me that ancient India, in some ways, has a lot of cultural affinity to the modern West. It was a time of cultural and technological change. There was a lot of coming and going of different groups. You know, there's a lot of interplay. There was certainly more social freedom than there was later in India, as the caste system became more rigidified. It was at least the beginning of a mercantile society.
A lot of social chaos and upheaval.
Yes, yeah. So I think and when you read the suttas and you pay attention to the stories that, you know, the backstories to a lot of the suttas, they don't seem that alien. You know, they seem they're relatable. The people are relatable in the suttas, characters, you know.
Yeah, especially to us who have a lot of familiarity with it. I think to a newcomer, it might seem a little more alien than to us, but still
Possibly.
it's, yeah. I mean, still in some ways, you know, ancient North India was similar to Europe in its approach. I mean, you had experiments with democracy and so forth.
Yeah.
You had more freedom. You know, you could walk around naked in ancient India. It was considered to be kind of crude and, you know, what's the word, vulgar, but I mean, it wasn't illegal. You know, there was a certain amount of freedom back
Yeah.
then that is now lacking.
Yeah.
But
I think
still,
Buddhism, it appeals to the Western mind, like it's timeless. It seems scientific, rational. Also, the idea of rebirth is kind of accepted. You know, past lives, future lives, karma makes more sense to people than the Christian idea. I think it appeals to the intelligent mind. I think I think in terms of interfaith and comparative religion, Buddhism fares very well. It's quite popular. It's quite respectable in the West. And a lot of great thinkers in Western history have thought of Buddhism quite highly. So I think it's got a good future here.
yeah, there is a lot of like people on the right who have turned to Theravada Buddhism because of Julius Evola's book on Buddhism, where it's, you know, he is kind of claiming it as is sort of in harmony with the European spirit because it's like an Indo-European system, and you know he's got the Arahant almost set up like the Nietzschean Superman and so forth, which kind of romanticizes the whole situation.
Yeah.
But there's one thing that I would like to mention, that it's very common in my experience that even serious Western Buddhists are so conditioned to adopt Western ethics that they really don't get Buddhist ethics, that Buddhist ethics are psychological rather than, you know, sort of the materialistic utilitarianism of Western ethics, where it's like, you know, the monk who sits on the shore and lets a pretty girl drown because it's against the rules for him to give her mouth to mouth resuscitation or whatever, that literally he's not doing anything wrong. I mean, he's not doing anything good either necessarily, but just the Buddhist ethics, it's subjective. It's with regard to what is getting you closer to enlightenment or farther away from it, and not with regard to whether the people around you are happy or not necessarily. And a lot of Western people, even though they might be serious in their Buddhism, they've just been brought up into a culture, just born and raised into this culture that has this Western utilitarian ethic that they just don't get Buddhist ethics.
Right. The way I like to explain it, and is that Theravada ethics is always promulgated or formulated in terms of the actor or the agent.
Yeah.
So that there's a difference even with Mahayana ethics, where compassion is like a trump card. right? You can do any kind of deed that would be a breaking precepts if it was done out of compassion.
Yeah, you can kill out of compassion.
There's a Jataka story that occurs in the Mahayana. It's not found in the Theravada collection. It illustrates this. Is that a ship with 500 merchants. One of them is the Bodhisattva, and he has psychic powers. He can read the minds of the others. And one of the other merchants is a criminal. He's a robber. He's got a plan to kill everybody in the night and steal control of the ship, take all the goods and jewels, steal them. So the Bodhisattva, to save the other 400 plus people on the ship, he kills the evildoer, and then he is himself seized as a murderer and put to death. So he kills the murderer and sacrifices his own life to save the others. That would not occur in the Theravada because it's still an act of killing, but in the Mahayana interpretation, it's allowable because of it was done out of compassion. And I think that appeals more to the average Westerner, that kind of way of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. A
Another
lot of Westerners, they just don't get, even just monks not handling money or feeding themselves. They just don't.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's another thing. Yeah, you're not.
So that kind of worked in China too. I think that's one reason why Chinese monks became farmers, is because beggars didn't have nearly as high of a reputation in China as they did in India.
Yeah. Whereas in India, it was seen as virtuous to be make yourself dependent on the mercy of others.
Yeah, you mentioned the precept, pannobhasa, that you can't have money and you can't have it held for you. I guess with our Western monks, it's quite common that money's held for them, because often monks, they disrobe, probably more than 50% eventually disrobe, then they go back to their money, and some come from wealthy families. You don't really hear about a Western monk actually giving up all of their money, being flat broke, and then disrobing and being flat broke. What about Ajahn Punnadhammo?
I didn't have a lot of money to start with, but I spent most of what I had left to get to Thailand, and then a few days before I ordained, I gave away the remnant of my money. I actually had zero resources when I ordained. I did deliberately. I didn't want to do otherwise.
Well, very good. But I guess many of the monks just leave it in trust with their family.
Yeah. That's very common.
But Pannobhasa is saying that's a violation of the precepts, right?
Yeah, that technically that would be against the rules. I fudged on the rules when I first ordained, and I donated all the money to the monastery. But I said I had some condition that, I mean, if I stayed there for more than 6 months or something, then they could keep it, something like that. Or I gave myself like an escape route just in case it was a bad situation or something.
But you're saying during the Buddha's time, money wasn't such a big thing in terms of their economy. Where now it is, like, money is so pervasive in our lives. Maybe it's hard to just, and the cost of everything. If someone wants to become a monk, it's kind of hard to give up maybe everything if they're middle-aged, right? Disrobe.
Yeah, getting rid of things is difficult until you've gotten rid of them, and then it's kind of a relief to be rid of them. Like when I first ordained, getting rid of all my books, I had a lot of books, and that was really like a trial. But once I got rid of them, I mean, it was just kind of a relief. You just feel like lighter, you've got less baggage, literally. Yeah. So it's getting rid of it to begin with is the hard part. After that, it's easier.
Yeah, that's true. I found that too.
Yeah, but even like technically getting into the money rules, I mean, even just consenting to somebody keeping money for you is still, I mean, you're breaking the same rules if you're handling it yourself. Although, I mean, outwardly it's better, but
not really. There is one rule in the Patimokkha about the way I think it's the longest rule.
Oh yeah.
About how to deal with a lay person who's been entrusted. Like if one lay person wants to donate money to pay for robes or any other necessities for the monk. He gives it to this layperson who is in care of it. And the monk is not supposed to directly ask for it or
Yeah, I'm in need of a robe.
yeah, but what if it's kind of funny the way it's phrased is that if this lay steward misappropriates the funds for his own use, he doesn't spend it on the monk is supposed to not complain but just stand silently outside his door.
Yeah, well, eventually he's supposed to go and tell the people who donated it that the money is not being used the way they
Bad
wanted.
boy.
Yeah, so yeah, it's like you're allowed what 2 or 3 times to tell them I need a robe, and if they don't give you the robe, then you're allowed like what is it 5 or 6 times to just stand outside their door and not say anything.
And if they ask you what are you standing there for, you're supposed to say you should know, sir.
Yeah.
Oh.
But there's also a rule, I think it might be in the commentaries, where somebody wants to donate money to a monk and the monk says, no, I don't handle money. And then he says, well, I'll put it here in this safe place, or I'll give it to so-and-so. And then for your benefit. And if the monk doesn't like the idea, he can remain silent. But if he likes the idea, then he's supposed to say, no, don't do it. I can't remember if that's in the Vibhanga, Sutta Vibhanga, or in the commentames, but it's in there somewhere.
It's probably in the commentary. I don't recall that exact detail. But I know that there is, like, this is from the commentary, that which a lot of monks nowadays, especially in Thailand, a lot of the monks are kind of loose in their vinaya, they accept money in their alms bowl, which is an offense. But the way it's stated in the commentary, if you're on alms round and someone puts money into your bowl without your consent, what you're supposed to do with it is toss it over your shoulder, get rid of it without looking at where it lands, and walk away.
Yeah, that's what I did when I first came to Asia. I went for alms round in Bangkok, and people were just putting money on my bowl lid. And then I wouldn't say anything or do anything at the time, but after they'd walked away, I'd just blow it off and keep going.
I got money in my bowl when I was a monk. I got a bit of that. Sometimes I did use it to pay the Songtao drivers, because the Songtao drivers, they would let the monk go for free often, and they don't make much money. So I would sometimes pay with it. But in our monastery, people did that, not like the Ajahn Chah tradition.
A lot of Thai monks actually handle money, and then there's some. I've heard that there's some monks who interpret the rules over literally. Like I heard about one abbot of a small village monastery who would count the cash from the donation box with chopsticks.
So it didn't put his hand, didn't handle it with his hands.
Yeah.
Just wear gloves.
Yeah.
But to my way, the way I interpret things, in which others may disagree, but I tend to take the spirit more than the letter. I think the spirit is not to have money or have control of money, but I don't feel like I'm doing an offense if, say, they come out with a new dollar coin, and I'm curious and say, oh, someone's got one, can I see it? And to look at it, but I'm not taking ownership of it. I'm handling it just as an object and hand it back. I don't find that as an offense. Some would.
Yeah,
it's not a big deal. I want to mention about the precepts. So didn't the Buddha say one of the causes of going to hell is introducing a false patimokkha? Like he said, don't change the precepts.
Yeah.
It's one of the causes of going to hell.
That's one of the principles of Vinaya, that you can't be added to or deleted from. They're fixed for all time.
So that's a fundamental problem that pannobhasa is bringing up 2,500 years later.
Well, shortly
in America,
before he died, the Buddha did tell Ananda that after he dies, you can do away with the lesser and minor rules. And then at the first council, the Arahants could not agree on what the lesser and minor rules would be. Some Arahants supposedly were actually saying everything except Parajika is lesser and minor, but then they just decided just keep everything.
Yeah,
so that's up for a new council to review. Like when I was a monk, one monk said about 100 of the precepts are abandoned. He said abandoned. That was his English. So today, I guess they could let go of some of those lesser minor rules if they wanted to. If
theoretically, but a great council. I mean, the monks participate in great councils are conservative old Asian monks who they're not going to change much except for maybe a few punctuation marks or a few alternate readings in the Tipitaka. I mean, I think at the Great Council in Rangoon in 1956,
Yeah.
there was one of the Western the Western Buddhists, I think it was Christmas Humphreys, brought up the issue of smoking tobacco, and it was just too controversial. It was too out there, so they just tabled it and didn't deal with the issue.
So I wonder if it probably is not a cause of going to hell if you drop some of the precepts, the lesser ones.
Well, I mean, without the consent of a great council, I don't think it would be valid.
No, you can't really.
Can't, yeah.
There's nobody authorized to change the Vinaya.
Yeah.
So how do we address your question though, adapting it to America in 2022? I guess we're stuck then, aren't we?
Well, like I was saying, I mean, you could have, I mean, you can still have strict monks, although they'd be sort of like the tropical plant that has to live in the greenhouse and can't just wander around freely. Or then you could just have like the sort of the quasi monks that they're not fully ordained bhikkhus, but they could take lesser orders, so to speak, like in Catholicism, and still, I mean, they'd fit into the culture. They'd have a little more freedom, and they wouldn't look as strange because they wouldn't be wearing the brown toga.
Could they be like the Protestant minister and have a wife?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not.
Well, I don't really have any objection to that sort of a model, as long as it doesn't replace the actual Sangha.
Yeah.
Historically, that did happen in Sri Lanka. There was like 100 or 150 years when there were no fully ordained bhikkhus until.
Yeah, well, that was just because they were a parajika. They were still like dressed as bhikkhus and living at monasteries, weren't they? It's just that they were like married and had children and so forth.
No, they gave up calling themselves bhikkhus. They admitted they weren't bhikkhus.
I see.
Lay teachers. They wore, I think it was white robes. They wore some kind of different robes, and they had this status as being like the Buddhist teachers, but they weren't bhikkhus. And then the order was reestablished out of Thailand. This was the origin of the Siam Nikaya.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, there was one time they did it from Burma also. I think that's the Amarapura Nikaya.
I like that idea of a quasi Sangha, because like when I was working with the Birken Forest Master, I was a lay teacher for 20 years, but I was just invisible to the Thais. Like they never noticed me, never donated 20 bucks over this 20-year period. And I was supporting the monastery, sending people there. I was like, I was part of it, but I wasn't recognized at all. I wasn't recognized by the monks either. I was just something I chose to do,
That would be a totally alien model to the Asians. They really have.
Yeah, the Burmese do not consider monks to be human beings. There's a different word for monks than there is for human beings.
But
they're just kind of superhuman
teachers, right? Though, like the Thais say, a lay Buddhist professor in a university in Thailand. They have lay teachers in Thailand, don't they? In Burma,
they do. Probably Thailand more than Burma, but they have nowhere near the status of monks, and they're nowhere. They're not. I don't know if anybody could possibly make a living doing that.
I actually managed to do it, right? I was teaching like 2 hours a night, like 4 or like 5 days a week, and all day Saturday. I was actually getting by doing it. But yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't efficient for supporting Buddhism in the West, that the lay teachers who I was supporting the monastery rather than the Insight Meditation Society, which is anti-monk. I was actually supporting the monastery, the monks. But the donation was to go to the monastery. I just had to get by on whatever the school board would pay, Yeah, but how to make Theravada grow in the West? I guess we haven't solved it. It's an important issue. But like Ajahn was saying, it does work, and the monks actually, it does seem to work. Like with the Ajahn Chah tradition, monks can travel with no money, and it seems to be growing in the West. I remember Ajahn Theravada was here once. He was comparing Spirit Rock and IMS in Massachusetts, saying that they're not fully paying their mortgages, so they're not actually paying for all their costs, but our monasteries are being paid for, like Abhayagiri, the money's there. There's a lot of support from the Thais, more so than these lay centers. So it seems to be working for the monastics more so than the Insight Meditation Society was
Yeah,
telling me.
I'm just running a small hermitage here, and when I first started, it was difficult to find enough support, but now we're comfortable. We're managing to get enough support to keep going.
That's
That's
good. And it's
good.
probably growing in the West, right? Yeah. Like look at our monasteries. Got one in New Hampshire now. It's growing, and
Yeah,
they're actually buying real estate.
Yeah, I don't think, I don't think we should be too impatient. Like I've seen a lot of progress in 30 years. And it's brand new. I mean, from a historical point of view.
Yeah.
Theravada Buddhism has only been in any form in the West for less than half a century.
Yeah. Look at England. We've got a few monasteries there, in Europe as well. So
Yeah,
it
like
is,
the
and
late
it's
70s,
encouraging.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Ajahn Sumedho really got established around 1977, and he was, respected across Europe, and it really took off.
Mhm. Yeah, so
So-
I'm not in despair about establishing Theravada Buddhism. I think it's actually doing well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it may take more chaos and upheaval really to get people more interested in like Dhamma, or just to turn away from the world. I mean, that's pretty much what was happening in the Buddha's time. Because there's so much chaos and upheaval that people were in despair of worldly life and just turning towards a more spiritual life. And that's often the way it works, is when times are bad, people turn towards spirituality, because the worldliness isn't working for them nearly so well. So it could be that we're what we would need is more chaos and upheaval, and then some charismatic Theravada Buddhist teacher to strike traction or something, if we were going to have it really take root or some such. Although that, as the Ajahn is saying, it's it is gradually making progress, so there is
Yeah.
that. But still, there is the issue of just the fact that Theravada Buddhism was designed for a culture that really is very alien to the West in many respects.
Mm.
Maybe
Well-
it's timeless in a Pacifico.
Yeah, the teachings are very applicable. I don't find, they're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
antiquated in any way.
Yeah, it's mostly just the outward form. I mean, some of the cosmology maybe, and especially the rules for monastics.
Yeah.
And
I just-
just not being able to feed themselves, for example.
Well,
Other
that
than
I find
Amber,
it's actually a very useful rule, because it keeps the bhikkhus in close contact with the laity, so they have to interact with the laity.
yeah, it's a good rule. Yeah.
Like a lot of us would if we could just store our own food, and we wouldn't want to bother with dealing with people. We go off into a cabin in the woods with a big 50-pound sack of rice, and just stay there and do your practice. And
Yeah.
Buddha deliberately set it up so that there has to be this daily interaction. Like, we're not allowed to store food, and we don't do it in Ajahn Chah monasteries. I know some monks are slack on that, but in our tradition, we try and keep it strictly that you only eat what's been given to you that day, right? So there has to be lay people to offer you the food.
Yeah, I was making kind of a problem. When I first came back from Burma the last time, I was staying in a Asian temple, and the lay people are busy. Burmese people as well as Americans, they have to go to work in the morning, and sometimes it just wasn't convenient for anybody to drop by in the morning and offer food. So I would just fast those days, and it got people really worried, because the Burmese are not into fasting. They think you're going to starve to death in 48 hours or some such, and they were scrambling to get together a schedule to make sure that somebody would come every day, just so that I would eat food, because the Asian monks they would just cook their own breakfast if nobody
Oh.
was
Yeah.
was bringing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that in Sri Lankan temples in the West that I've stayed overnight at. I've seen them, the monks cook for themselves in the morning.
And then also, like, you're pretty far north. I mean, the allowable time for eating might get down to only an hour or so, wouldn't it?
No, we're not that far north. I mean,
Oh, okay.
the Thunder Bay it's actually on, if you look on a globe, it's on the same latitude as Paris.
Oh, okay.
But
Wow, that's strange.
but because of it's so inland, it's a continental climate, so we get
Yeah.
very cold in the winter, but the days aren't that short.
Oh, I see. But someplace like Fairbanks, Alaska, or
Yeah,
Yukon Territory, something like that, you might have relatively short. I mean, in the wintertime, I mean, there would be no dawn at all.
Yeah,
If you're north of the Arctic Circle.
Ajahn Passano, who comes from he was born in northern Manitoba.
Yeah, Flin Flon, Manitoba, right?
Yeah, and when
Yeah.
I was a junior monk, he was the abbot at Wapananashat, and he went back for a visit to Canada, and he was telling us when he got back that he went up for a few days up above the Arctic Circle because one of his brothers was working up there in the Northwest Territories, and he went up to visit him. And that got me thinking, and I said, well, how do you keep the vinaya above the Arctic Circle? Because if you were to interpret it literally, you could eat anytime you want between March and June, and the rest of the year you couldn't eat at all. Right? And he said, he's very practical, down to earth, right? He said, I just arbitrarily said 6 a.m. to noon by the clock.
That's what I would do. That makes sense. Yeah.
If I was a monk, I think I'd just avoid the Arctic Circle altogether.
I would adapt to it.
Yeah, because I mean, there were obviously. I wondered if Ajahn Passano at that time was actually the first Theravada monk ever above the Arctic Circle. It's possible.
Wow.
That's possible. I don't know.
Wow.
I did have some correspondence with a Theravada monk who's living in Iceland, but that's still below the Arctic Circle.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Oh,
just below.
wow. So anything else? Are we done with establishing the Theravada in the West? We did it.
Yeah.
Well, it's defined. We could say that one point I'd like to add there is that it is established in the West because the traditional definition of when Buddhism is established in the country is when native sons are ordaining native sons.
Yeah, and they're doing a uposatha ceremony on Inasima on native soil.
Yeah, so that's already happened in several Western countries, including Canada and the US.
Yeah.
UK. So.
Yeah.
Well, long may the Dhamma stand.
Yeah, thousands of years to come.
Yeah. But
Okay.
Chiram Dhammam Ditadu, is that how you say it? My Pali's rusty.
I don't know what I didn't catch what you're trying to say.
Oh, it's like on the beginning of on the cover of Dhamma books in Burma, it says Chiram, like Chiram Dhammam Ditadu, something like that. It's long may the Dhamma stand. Like Chiram is long, Dhammam, and Ditadu is may it stand,
Okay, yeah. Okay.
So
Okay, well,
yeah.
Well, thanks for the topic, Pannobhasa. Thank you, Ajahn Punnadhammo.
Okay, so that's good. So we've done 3 topics today. I'll try and think of something for next time.
Very good.
All right.